I'm going to show how I turned an old bookcase into a large charging station. This station will consolidate and organize the many rechargeable items that I have, whether it's lighting, batteries, cameras, devices. Their charging cords will be concealed and ready to use. I was searching for a used bookcase that had particular dimensions. It needed to fit in a certain spot in my office, and since there was a floor vent in that spot, I also needed a bookcase that had legs. This one was perfect. However, since it was used, it was a bit rickety. This is an easy fix with flat-cornered braces that I purchased for around $3. Each brace was strategically placed on the back four corners of the bookcase. These were secured into place using the screws that were provided. Adding these significantly improved the integrity of the bookcase. I should also address the hole that I cut in the back. This was done earlier in order to expose and access the outlet where the bookcase will be located in my office. Next, I added some deck screws in various locations in order to further the strength of the structure. I did my best to place screws in locations that were out of view. Even though function was more important, I still wanted it to look good. Now that the structure was improved, the shelves were removed to make room for the power strip installation. I bought this 3-foot long, 9-outlet power strip at the local Walmart store. I decided to install it on the inner side instead of the inner back. This will keep the power cords on one side, leaving an open shelf space. Unfortunately, the sides of this bookcase consist of thin panels. Mounting blocks for the power strip will need to be made and installed. For this, I used a scrap piece of lumber, and I cut blocks to fit within the frame of the bookcase. Using a Kreg jig, I created pocket holes for the mounting screws. I created 2 on each end, as seen here. Once I decided on the mounting location, the block was leveled and clamped into place. Next, I secured using Kreg pocket screws. Using the power strip as a measuring device, I repeated this process on the lower mounting block. Next, the shelves will need to be notched in order to fit over the power strip. I needed to create a pattern for the proper size notch. I created one using a block of wood. I then centered the pattern on the edge of the shelf and traced it using a permanent marker. The notch was then cut out using a jigsaw in this manner. I then repeated this method on each shelf, making sure it was done on the correct side with mirrored measurements. Next, I centered and secured the power strip to the mounting blocks using a screw on each end. Once the power strip was secured, I started on the shelf installation. Starting with the top shelf, I checked it for fit and determined its mounting location. It was important to install the shelves so they weren't covering an outlet. Once the shelf was fine-tuned between the outlets, I made a mark where the shelf brackets would be placed. I used 3/4-inch corner braces that I bought at a local hardware store for my shelf brackets. There are 4 in a pack and screws are included. Using Scotch tape, I held the bracket into its proper location on the mark. I then secured it into place using one of the screws. I repeated this method on all 4 corners, making sure each bracket was placed using the same measurements down each support. Accurate measurements were important so that the shelf would be level when installing. Once the corner brackets were in place, the shelf could be installed by simply resting it on top of the brackets. As seen here, it fit perfectly around the power strip and was placed well between the outlets. I continued with this installation method until all the shelves were installed. Next, I wanted to install a pegboard above the top shelf for hanging extra cords and accessories. I simply measured the space above on the protruding structures. This would allow a cavity between the pegboard and the back panel. I then measured and marked the pegboard to those dimensions. Using a jigsaw, I cut the piece out. I did have to make a few custom cuts in order to fit it through the opening, as well as to span the power strip mounting block. Once I was satisfied with the fit, I removed it so it could be painted later on. Next, lighting will be installed under the top and under each shelf. I purchased plug-in style lights equipped with an inline switch. These lights have an octopus distribution, which means each light has a long wire that connects to a central plug, called the junction box. I began by removing a shelf and turning it upside down with the bottom facing up. I then used a yardstick that was placed corner to corner in order to find the center. Due to notched corners on one side, it was important to be consistent on which corner to use so that each shelf was marked the same. I was more interested in side-to-side symmetry than finding perfect center from front to back. Once the relative center was found, a light was placed and installed at that spot. To mount, I unthreaded the lens cover to expose the two mounting holes. The light was carefully positioned on the center mark and secured using 2 screws that were included in the box. Then the lens was returned and the shelf was hung back into place. I then drilled a hole through the back panel where it meets the shelf. This was directly behind the light so that the wires would be better concealed. The wire was then threaded through the hole and left to dangle behind the bookcase. This process was repeated on each of the shelves as well as the top of the bookcase, leaving all the wires hanging on the back side. Next, I secured the switch behind the front lip of one of the shelves. I secured it into place using cable staples. The staples were modified by replacing the nail with a screw. Once secure, the shelf was returned to the bookcase and the switch wires were threaded through the same hole as the light. Next, the wires in the back were connected and concealed. First, I took the distributor section and connected it to the switch plug in this manner. Then I plugged the lights into the junction box. I continued on until all 5 lights were plugged in. Note, the kit came with 6 lights, but I only needed 5 for this project. Therefore, 1 terminal in the hub will be left empty. Next, I gathered the wires and taped them together. I worked my way down from top to bottom until they were all consolidated as seen here. Even though they were well bound, I still wanted to add a final layer of protection. I accomplished this with use of cable covers that I bought at Walmart in the electronics department. These come in sections and they simply encase the wires within. On the back side is an adhesive strip. I removed the protective film and stuck it in place as seen here. Then, with the wires inside, I snapped the cover shut. I continued on with the next section, butting it up to the previously installed section. The last section was cut to fit, leaving the junction box exposed. Next, I installed the cable raceways. These are cable management conduits that will be installed on the top front edge of each shelf. I purchased the 2" by 1" StarTech wire duct. These are slotted raceways that I found online. I purchased 3 of these, which came in 5.5-foot lengths. That was more than enough for this project, and I had extra left over. Here's an example of how the raceway works. Pinch the sides of the channel, working your way down while lifting off the cover. Next, lay the cable within the channel, placing the plug end in one of the slots in this manner. Then return the cover to the raceway. This neatly conceals the cables, but will leave the plug exposed for easy access and use. When installing the raceways, I began by measuring the width of the shelf on its front exposed edge between the vertical supports. Using a hacksaw, I cut a section of the raceway to that length and checked it for fit. Once all the pieces were cut, I gathered them on a piece of cardboard and painted them to closely match the bookcase. I chose a spray paint that was rated for multiple surfaces, including plastic. Once dry, I started with installing the pegboard. I secured into place using truss head lath screws. Finally, I installed the cable raceways. I first removed the cover and squared it to the edge of the shelf. Then I secured it into place using the lath screws through the mounting slots within. The cover was then returned to the raceway and checked for fit. I repeated this process on each shelf until all the raceways were installed. The bookcase charging station is now ready to be moved to the house and filled.